Imagine walking into a school where the only absolute rule is that you must ruthlessly question absolutely everything. No sacred cows, no unquestioned assumptions, no comfortable dogmas whatsoever. Today, we're diving into a profoundly radical moment in ancient secular philosophy, the Socratic turn of the academia. We're going to break down how this legendary institution fundamentally transformed itself, going from a place that heavily guarded rigid doctrines into an absolute engine of intellectual warfare. Now, we live in a modern world totally filled with echo chambers, right? People who are fiercely, unconditionally certain they hold the truth. So looking back at an ancient institution that dedicated itself entirely to dismantling certainty, well, it's not just a history lesson. It is a masterclass in how to navigate a world obsessed with dogma. We'll explore how they systematically tore down positive philosophical systems, weaponizing the critical, questioning dialectic found in the early dialogues of Socrates.
We're going to track this evolution across 6 distinct phases. We'll start with the initial Socratic dialectical turn, look at the context of their institutional shift, break down their skeptical methodology and ethical framework, examine their massive intellectual clash with the Stoics, and finally look at their peak and ultimate decline.
All right. Part 1, the Socratic dialectical turn. Let's look at the exact catalyst for this monumental shift. To really grasp what the formidable thinker Arcesilaus pulled off here, you kind of have to picture ancient philosophy as a landscape of competing, heavily armed fortresses. Before his leadership, later doctrinal Platonism was absolutely obsessed with establishing positive philosophical systems. They were essentially building these massive intellectual castles of dogmatic doctrine just to defend against rival schools. But Arcesilaus realized something brilliantly counterintuitive. Building a fortress is actually a massive vulnerability. Think about it. The second you plant a flag and declare, "This is the absolute truth," you just created an infinite perimeter that you now have to defend against every single counterargument. So he executed a masterful pivot. He entirely abandoned the castle. He dragged the school directly back to the relentless critical questioning of the early dialogues of Socrates. By refusing to build a positive system of their own, the academia became essentially intellectual ghosts. They became totally untouchable. Their entire operational mandate shifted to infiltrating the fortresses of their opinionated opponents and exposing their structural, logical fragility from the inside out. They didn't want to prove what was true. They wanted to prove that you literally couldn't be certain about what you thought was true. Which brings us to part 2, the context of institutional shift. How did this strategic pivot actually rewrite the internal DNA of the academy itself? Well, in the ancient world, institutional allegiance was incredibly rigid. You can compare it to modern political tribalism, where you just download an entire operating system of beliefs and defend it to the death. Belonging to a philosophical school back then typically demanded absolute, dogmatic adherence to a fixed ideology. But this new academy completely shattered that paradigm. True school loyalty was radically redefined. It shifted completely away from protecting a vulnerable set of doctrines. Instead, your loyalty was pledged to a rigorous method of continuous critical inquiry. To be a member of the academia wasn't about holding a specific opinion anymore. It was about participating actively in a perpetual, structural dismantling of all assumptions. It's like pledging allegiance not to a specific piece of software, but to the endless process of finding the bugs in the code. Moving to part 3, methodology of the argument. Let's dig into exactly how they executed this practically. This right here brings us to the tactical genius of the academic method. Their explicit requirement was to argue with equal force on both sides of any given philosophical thesis. Put yourself in an ancient lecture hall for a second. A brilliant philosopher gets up and argues for a specific thesis so powerfully, so flawlessly, that you are 100% convinced. Then, without missing a single beat, that exact same philosopher turns right around and argues the exact opposite thesis with identical brilliance and unshakable logic. Your brain essentially just blue screens. Now, this wasn't just rhetorical gymnastics or showing off. It was a deeply serious structural device to achieve something known as equipollence. By constructing equally forceful arguments for and against a proposition, they engineered a complete mental stalemate. It intentionally paralyzed your ability to confidently agree with either side. The whole design was to forcefully dismantle certainty and expose the deep internal contradictions hiding within the assertions of competing schools. It was, quite literally, a methodology of total logical exhaustion. Okay, part 4, ethical and philosophical framework.
because this intense skepticism brings up a massive, very practical problem.
How do you actually live your daily life without holding any firm opinions? To answer this, we have to rigorously define their central operating principle, epoche. This is the systematic and absolute suspension of opinion or judgment. Now, as you might guess, historical critics of the academia absolutely pounced on this concept. They leveled a very severe accusation, basically saying, hey, if you suspend all judgment, you destroy the very mechanism of human action. If you believe in absolutely nothing, you're just going to sit on the couch and starve to death. You'll become a vegetable. And honestly, it's a fair question. How can one act justly if one cannot definitively judge what justice even is? But the Academy fiercely defended themselves. They argued that epoche was absolutely not a state of vegetative paralysis. Rather, it was an active, highly disciplined mental posture. By refusing to give absolute assent to anything, you actually protected your intellect from being tricked by false dogma, all while still allowing yourself to live a highly functional, ethically sound life in a secular society.
The way they solved this so-called problem of action is genuinely brilliant, and it feels incredibly modern to us today. Step 1 demands the absolute realization of epoche, systematically suspending all dogmatic opinions. But Step 2 introduces the vital pivot, evaluating arguments based purely on practical plausibility, or what they called the Pythanon. We actually do this every single day. When you cross a busy street, you don't possess absolute dogmatic metaphysical certainty that a car won't hit you, right? You just look both ways and determine that it's highly plausible the road is clear. Absolute certainty is entirely unnecessary for action. You only need to determine what is reasonably plausible within a specific context. And then, Step 3 is simply executing practical action driven by that plausibility. This entire framework allowed an individual to navigate their societal duties and act with complete moral integrity, all while remaining completely immune to the rigid, inevitable failures of dogmatism.
Now for Part 5, the Great Stoic Battle. It's time to see the Academy wage all-out intellectual warfare against their primary rivals, the Stoa. The absolute epicenter of this clash revolves around a highly contested Stoic concept, phantasia katalyptiki. Let's translate this out of the dense academic jargon for a second. The Stoics believed in what they called cognitive impressions. The easiest way to visualize this is like a hot wax seal. The Stoics argued that when you perceive a true fact in the universe, it stamps itself onto your soul so perfectly and so clearly that it is physically impossible for you to mistake it for a falsehood. This was the foundational, absolute dogmatic criterion of truth for the entire Stoic system. It all rested on this. So the Academy knew that if they could successfully break this concept, if they could logically prove that the wax seal could be forged, the entire towering edifice of Stoic philosophy would instantly collapse under its own weight. And the academic counterattack against this rigid Stoic criteria was absolutely devastating. The Stoics, championed by towering figures like Chrysippus, demanded absolute reliance on these perfect cognitive impressions. But the Academy launched a relentless interrogation. They asked a very simple yet lethal question. What about dreams? What about madness or sensory illusions? They systematically proved that for every allegedly true impression a perfectly sane, sober Stoic could experience, a madman could experience a completely indistinguishable, absolutely identical false impression. Think about it. A person hallucinating believes their false reality just as strongly and just as vividly as you believe your true reality. Therefore, they argued, there is no internal absolute marker that guarantees you are right and they are wrong. The wax seal is completely useless as a perfect metric for truth. You really have to imagine how incredibly exhausting it must have been to be a Stoic during this era. You write an entire book carefully establishing your philosophy, and the academics just casually tear it to shreds. The Academy engaged in a systematic dismantling of Chrysippus logic. They launched severe ethical critiques directly targeting the Stoic definitions regarding the very end of living. Because these skeptical arguments were so lethal and structurally sound, the Stoa was completely denied the luxury of intellectual complacency. The Academia literally forced their rivals into a constant, never-ending state of doctrinal refinement. They compelled the Stoics to continuously rewrite their own definitions and frantically patch up the holes in their fortresses just to survive the skeptical onslaught. Finally, Part 6, Carneades and the Decline. Let's look at the zenith and the ultimate structural fall of this intellectual powerhouse.
To truly understand the absolute peak of the Academy, we have to talk about the unmatched genius of Carneades. This guy was an absolute titan of ancient literature. He wasn't just a formidable institutional head, he was a devastatingly brilliant critic of Chrysippus and a highly original thinker in his own right.
The historical accounts of his dialectical prowess describe a man capable of what can really only be called persuasive violence. There is this famous historical event where he traveled to Rome as an ambassador. On the very first day, he gave a breathtaking, beautiful speech defending the absolute necessity of justice, completely dazzling the Roman senators. But then, the very next day, he stood up and delivered an equally brilliant, logically flawed speech, proving that justice is entirely a myth designed for the weak. He terrified the Romans. He literally left his audiences intellectually shattered. Under Carneades, the rigorous methodology of the academia reached its absolute peak, solidifying its position as the ultimate secular mechanism for interrogating human knowledge. But how does a structural framework this powerful eventually fracture? Honestly, it comes down to the human element. The sheer psychological weight of maintaining absolute skepticism is incredibly heavy. Eventually, people just want a solid floor to stand on, you know? They want to believe in something. Following that 2nd century BC peak under Carneades, this weight became completely unsustainable for later scholars. Severe internal philosophical divisions began to emerge. This led to a fatal institutional splintering under Philon, who basically began diluting the strict skeptical criteria just to give people a break. And it culminated in a total irreversible divergence by Antiochus, who actively dragged the remnants of the academy back into the exact same dogmatism that Arcesilaus had originally destroyed centuries earlier. Ultimately, looking back at all of this, we have to ask ourselves a profound question about the enduring legacy of this incredible movement. Did the relentless, absolute dialectical rigor of the academia ultimately destroy itself by making any foundational knowledge impossible to maintain? Or by subjecting every single positive assertion to the brutal, unforgiving fire of critical interrogation, did it permanently immunize ancient secular philosophy against the intellectual tyranny of unquestioned dogma? It's a tension that exists right down to the present day in how we consume information and form our own beliefs. So, what do you think? Keep questioning, keep interrogating, and we'll see you in the next explainer.